Hey guys, it's Tim, coming at you with something a little bit different this week. If you've been subscribed to our channel for a decent amount of time, or have gone back to look at previous videos that I've done, you'll see that I've done a lot of reviews for comic book animation. That's because comic book animated series and movies hold a very special place in my heart because, like with many people, that's where I started off in my comic book fandom. And animation is one of the best mediums for comic books to transition into because of the lack of limitation that allows to transition as much from the original source material as possible onto the screen. And because of this, there have been many great comic book animated series based on comic books that have existed throughout the years. However, I've decided to put down a list of my top 13 comic book animated series. Whether they be for accuracy, impact, or just the general entertainment value, these are the top 13 series that I can always go back to. And like all lists like this is going to be very subjective, and I guarantee that there will be things on this list that people won't agree with me on, whether for omitting or for general placement if it does make it onto the list. This doesn't necessarily mean that I think that show is bad, just that it doesn't resonate with me like these other shows do. Or that I've never seen it. And I'm also adding a rule into this that I just personally like to do when I make lists, where only one series per subject matter can make it onto the list. That way the list doesn't get bogged down by tons of entries of the same thing and it adds more variety. So with that said, let's move on to my top 13 comic book animated series. Number 13. Legion of Superheroes. Coming out near the tail end of what was known as Kids WB, this is probably one of the most underrated comic book animated series I've ever seen. And to be fair, it's not like the Legion of Superheroes are the most well-known comic book characters of all time, but I never really see anyone talk about this show that often. And to a degree I can understand why. The first season of the show is very typical Kids WB fare for what they were putting out at the time. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it just doesn't help it stand out all that much, though the second season definitely ups the ante from the first season by being much darker and telling a much stronger story. The characters are very unique from one another and very likable, and par for the course for DC, the animation on the series is very solid. Not being a huge fan of Legion of Superheroes, I found myself really liking the show and being entertained by it when I watched it. Though there's not a lot of competition for this is probably the best adaptation of the Legion of Superheroes outside of the comic books. Which makes it kinda disappointing that this series was so passed by when it was on. So why number 13 then? Well, even though I like the show, I will admit it doesn't really do anything to help itself stand out. It's just a very solid comic book animated series. And luckily there have been callbacks to it since this series came out, with Andy Midler and Kari Walgren reprising their roles of Lightning Lad and Saturn Girl in the LEGO DC movies. So even though a lot of people missed this series or have forgotten it, at least DC hasn't. Number 12. Fantastic Four, Earth's Greatest Heroes. Yup, another long shot making it onto the list. This series came out in the lead up to Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer. So you can probably understand why the series didn't make it past one season. Though the series ended up being a very solid portrayal of the Fantastic Four in a modern setting. Though the series definitely has elements that make it very much a product of its time, like aging down their heroes, or having all this the Batman-style high-tech gadgetry. Though to be fair, that actually ends up not detracting from the show all that much, and because they're aged down, separating Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman actually let the Invisible Woman shine a lot more than she has in other adaptations. And despite its design being kind of anime emo-ish, this series actually gave Dr. Doom the weight and gravitas he deserved throughout it that he really hadn't gotten so much in previous adaptations. Honestly, one of the biggest detracting points from the series is that, while I like Reed, Ben, and Sue on it, Johnny comes across as incredibly annoying this time around. They gave him a high-pitched nasally voice and he's always yelling, which, to be fair, kind of works for Johnny's character, but only in small doses, which this series unfortunately doesn't give him as a character. And while I've liked previous Fantastic Four animated series fine, I feel this overall is the strongest series despite its limited runtime. And you can't take this away from it. It's by far the best adaptation featuring an aged-down version of the Fantastic Four. Number 11. Static Shock. Yeah, this is probably one that people are going to be upset that didn't break the top 10, but I'll do my best to justify its positioning. Static Shock is, to date, the only adaptation of a milestone comic book character, at least in terms of having a whole series based around them. And because of this is probably the thing that most people know Static from. It's also the only show in the DCAU that didn't start off being in the DCAU, really only becoming a part of it when it crossed over with Batman in its second season. And the series is very beloved by the fan base that watched it back on Kids WB in the day. So why number 11? Well, going back and watching the series later after having grown up watching it, it really doesn't hold up as well for me. The animation for Season 1 really doesn't hold up all that well, and even after it got its animation bump in Season 2 and onward, it really never leaped up to the level of DC standard even at the time. Granted, it's not the worst DC animated project at that time, but it just doesn't hold up all that well animation-wise. And to be honest, some of their very special episodes come across as kind of cringy. Some of them work very well, but other ones, not so much. Though I think the thing that gives this series its strength, outside of its very solid voice cast, is its heart. The series always felt very genuine in its approach, even when it was crossing over with the Backstreet Boys or Lil Bow Wow, and the characters come across as very distinct and likable. And at the end of the day, even if it didn't make it into my top 10, I still loved the series and watched it all the time back when I was younger. Number 10. Iron Man Armored Adventures. This is a series that had people up against it right from its inception. A lot of people rolled their eyes at the idea of a teenage Tony Stark. But if you can get beyond that, you'll find a very solid animated series from this. From going up against the Black Widow and Hawkeye to the Extremis armor, this series had tons of the Iron Man mythos put into it. And I think this shines across best with its villains. They make them a lot more interesting and give them a lot more depth than even the comic book gives them at times. And the new design upgrades make them very distinct and interesting looking. This is another series that I find has one of the best Doctor Dooms in it that actually focuses on the magical and demonic elements of his backstory. Does the series make some confusing choices in its execution? Well, yes, it does. Just ask confusingly Russian Maria Hill. And of course, there's the whole having Tony, Rhodey, and Pepper being in high school as opposed to being adults like they've always been. But in a way, I actually do like that they went in a different direction than the Iron Man movies at the time when, especially nowadays, Marvel monopolizes so much on making their animation like their movies in almost every way. Plus, with the voiceover work of this series being done in Canada, there are a bunch of shoutouts and voice references to other series that had been voiced up there as well. Like the aforementioned Fantastic Four Earth's Greatest Heroes, or another series that you may or may not see on this list later on. I just feel like a lot of people fixated on one potentially bad element of this series and missed out on all the good things that it did provide. And I know this from experience because I thought I would hate this show going into it, and it ended up in my number 10 spot. Number 9. Superman the Animated Series. Though not the first show in the DCAU, it's definitely where the DCAU really started moving forward. This is where we really get to see other heroes outside of the main hero and his supporting cast in the DCAU. This series also ended up setting the standard for the style of DCAU shows moving forward. And this series was my introduction to Superman and most, if not all, of his rogues gallery. And if you listen to the recent episode of Super Friends this week, it's the version of Lex Luthor used in this series that made him my favorite comic book villain of all time. Clancy Brown gave one of the best performances, in my opinion, of any comic book character in adaptation to date, and I feel that he doesn't get the same recognition that Mark Hamill does for the Joker. Plus, this series, being about Superman after all, gave us a lot more large-scale threats than we have had in the DCAU previously, especially Darkseid and the New Gods. However, the reason why this series is number 9, not higher, is because, outside of the very good episodes of this show, all the other ones are kind of forgettable. But even though this series is about 50-50 in terms of how good its episodes are, it gave us some very strong villains, and that has to count for something. Number 8. The Incredible Hulk, 1996. This series is what I would describe as the Bill Bixby series if it didn't have a 1970s made-for-TV budget and wasn't ashamed of its comic book roots. This series has the same lonely man going from place to place, either trying to get by or trying to cure himself that series had, but also has classic comic book elements like the Leader or Abomination. And the series had a very melancholic tone, especially in its first season, as Bruce is trying to deal with this creature and trying to cure himself of it, while the Hulkbusters are constantly chasing him down. The series, especially in its first season, is carried by Neil McDonough's performance as Bruce Banner, which is an incredibly strong voice performance. And Lou Ferrigno, though not my favorite Hulk voice, definitely captures a lot of the character's innocence in his performance. I find this series to be the most engaging of its contemporaries at the time, especially the Fantastic Four and Iron Man series that came out roughly around the same time, that it eventually ended up crossing over with, and I feel portrayed them much stronger than even in their own shows. So why number 9? Because they kinda fucked it up in Season 2. It's not even that I dislike Season 2, cause I still find it entertaining, it's just that it's very watered down compared to Season 1 and makes it feel a lot less unique. But the first season I feel is enough to give it this placement, at least on my list. Number 7. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2003. This is probably the closest you're going to get to a direct adaptation of the comic book, but while mixing in various elements from previous series like the 87 series and the movies, while still managing to do its own thing even when it was directly adapting plots from the comic book series. And while arguments could be made for the 2012 series being superior to this one, that series never really clicked with me like this one did, though potentially that could be because that series came out when I was 20 as opposed to when I was 11. But even going back and watching this series now, the first 4 seasons are incredibly strong, which is very surprising considering that most of the voice work for this series came from 4Kids. Even going to very dark places, as far as body mutilation even. But like with the Incredible Hulk before it, this series ended up having later seasons ruining a good thing. One season so bad that they ended up aborting it early and going in a completely different direction. But those first 4 seasons are an incredibly strong adaptation of the Ninja Turtles, and especially the Shredder, who feels like a legitimate threat for the first time, even if some people do disagree with the twist about him. Personally, I think it's fine. Number 6. The Spectacular Spider-Man. Another ill-fated series from the end days of Kids WB. This is, in my opinion, the strongest adaptation of the Spider-Man mythos to date. And I grew up watching and loving the '94 Spider-Man animated series. But as good as that series got, it never felt as strong as what was presented here in Spectacular. For my money, Josh Keaton is the definitive voice for Spider-Man in my mind. And it does a good job meshing in elements from both the original comics, the Ultimate Comics, and even some stuff from the movies to make a very strong whole in the end. And I'm a big fan of the simplistic design style that the characters have in this show, cause not only does it make them easier to animate, so the animation's going to be stronger overall, but if you make a more simplistic design for a character that's good, it'll let the design age a lot better over time. And despite only having 26 episodes to its name, I feel that this series really captures Spider-Man the best out of anything he's been in outside of the comics. If I had to say a downside to the show, it's that I never really felt like Peter and Gwen had great romantic chemistry with one another, and it always felt like they were just putting in superfluous elements to just prevent Peter and Mary Jane from being together from the get-go. But despite some personal grievances, this series definitely lived up to its title. Number 5. Batman, the Animated Series. And this is the one that I feel people will have the most grievances with it being as low down as it is. The thing is, I didn't really grow up watching this show, so it really holds no nostalgic value to me. I actually didn't end up seeing this show until I was in high school. Not that the show is bad by any means, I mean, despite not having any nostalgic connection to it, it still made number 5 for me. And I can definitely see why people declare this to be one of, if not the best animated series of all time. But for me, it feels like the start of something great as opposed to the climax of it. And I feel like the people working behind the DCAU definitely learned and grew as they worked on this series in order to create bigger and better projects in the future. But because this series was so distinct, unique, and different at the time, they really didn't quite know what to do with it yet. But on the flip side to this show did give us a lot of things that became iconic of the Batman mythos, and comic book and television animation overall. You have Mark Hamill as the Joker, Kevin Conroy as Batman, the introduction of Harley Quinn, and the introduction to darker, more story-driven narratives for children's animation. You cannot deny this show's influence. It's just that this series doesn't connect with me the way that other series did in the future. But what else can I say about this show that people haven't said all over the place? It's Batman the Animated Series. If you're going to see a top anything list of comic book animated series, or animated series in general, it's gonna be on it. Number 4. The Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes. This is another series like Spectacular Spider-Man that does a really good job of blending elements from all over the Avengers mythos in order to create a really refined finished product. And for having so many characters on the show, I feel that it does a really good job balancing them. That and the series has a ton of great performances that have become the definitive voices that I think of when I read these characters. Even in Season 2, when all the behind-the-scenes interference started going on, I still feel like they were able to churn out a quality product, unlike a lot of series that ended up dropping off in later seasons for the same reason. And the series moves along very quickly. Especially in Season 1, almost every episode started, continued, or ended a plot point. And they're all weaved together fairly seamlessly to the point that it just feels like this is the natural order of events as opposed to sporadically jumping to different events. And if you're a big fan of Hawkeye like I am, he definitely gets tons of chances to shine throughout the course of this series, to the point that even on the TV tropes page, he's put down as being the person who always survives to the end of every encounter. This has been my favorite modern comic book animated series, and the fact that it got cancelled for such an inferior product really sours my taste towards Avengers Assembled, even if the over-reliance on the MCU didn't. Number 3. Teen Titans. Even though I think Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes balanced the number of characters that they had very well, I've always preferred having a more intimate set of characters as the team that we follow on a show. And Teen Titans, in my opinion, is the best example of that. From the beginning to the end, we only ever had 5 main characters, which left room for a lot of growth and development for all of them. Plus, I'm just a big fan of Teen Titans' style of storytelling. This was back when cartoon animated series were only around 12 to 13 episodes, so this actually ended up helping the show's seasonal storytelling while still allowing chances to balance out character developing episodes. Basically, every season would have 3 episodes that focused on the plot of the season, and then the 2 to 3 part finale that finished it off, with the exception of Season 5, which basically had an overarching seasonal plot with a few asides. So basically you would have an episode that set up what was going to happen and who the villain was. Then we would have several episodes of the characters interacting off of one another so they could develop and you could grow more attached to them. Then when it felt like just long enough had passed between when we learned about the plot, we get a new episode for the plot, and then go from there into more character building episodes, go back to the plot briefly before the end, have an episode that gives you a breather before the finale, and then the big finale that culminates in all of it. And I feel that this style of storytelling really works to the show's favor because it's just the right amount of story episodes and just the right amount of side episodes and character building episodes. Plus, from the weird to the menacing, this show has a really well-balanced rogues gallery, where almost everyone is memorable. Now, if only it hadn't aired its final episode, this series would be perfect. Number 2. Picking my number 2 choice was actually more difficult than I thought it would be, because while I always knew what the subject of the show would be that went here, I was having a hard time deciding which of their shows should go here. Because they never really had a bad show, and all of their shows to a degree are beloved by the fan base. So I had to go with the one that had the most personal connection to me, and when I went to that, the choice became obvious. So my number 2 choice is XMen Evolution. A weird choice of the 3, I know, though honestly if you've been paying attention to this list so far, it's probably not that surprising. But this show really is the one that has the deepest connection to me. I love all the characters on this show, from the heroes to the villains. And outside of some dated dialogue from the early 2000s, though honestly a lot of shows like this end up being dated by trying to be modern, the show still looks great and ages very well. Plus, while I don't like its storytelling quite as much as with Teen Titans, I still do really like how it told its story, especially in Season 2 and onward. Not only did it build towards the seasonal plot, but it also had a lot of foreshadowing of future events scattered throughout the seasons. Plus, in a move that's very unique to X-Men adaptations, they don't start off right away with the anti-mutant sentiments. In fact, that doesn't come around until Season 3. But by that point, you're invested in the characters, and all of that anti-mutant prejudice means more besides an allegory, because now it's happening to people you cared about before, as opposed to people you grow to care about going on. Personally, I love this show, and I can go back and watch it all the time. And Nightcrawler's image inducer on this show is the reason why, to this day, I wave with 2 fingers. Now before we get to number 1, I want to go over some honorable mentions that just missed making it onto this list for one reason or another. First off, we have Green Lantern the Animated Series. And I'm gonna be perfectly honest here, guys, I'm just not a huge fan of Green Lantern, especially Hal Jordan, so this series didn't appeal to me while it was airing. And even now, the show just doesn't really click with me the way that other shows do. But from what I have seen of it, the quality is definitely there, and I feel that if I was more of a fan of Green Lantern, this show definitely would have found a place on my list. But for now, I can say what I've seen of the show has been good, it's just not for me. Next up, we have Batman the Brave and the Bold. I really love this show and its more focus on all of the DC universe while using Batman as a jumping pad for everyone else. It had good comedy and good drama when it came down to it, but at the end of the day, I had to give the spot to Batman the Animated Series for what it meant to the industry as opposed to just what it meant to me. And finally, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. This is probably what I view as the pinnacle of comic book animation from before Batman the Animated Series came out and changed the game. I still have a lot of fun going back and watching it to this day. It's just that there's not really enough there to justify putting it on a top 13 best list. But definitely go out and watch it if you haven't yet. So, with all that out of the way, let's get to my top choice. Number 1. Justice League Unlimited. And for those wondering, yes, I count Justice League and Justice League Unlimited as one continuous show. This is really what I was alluding to back when I was talking about Batman the Animated Series. While Batman the Animated Series was a very strong base, I really feel that Justice League and Justice League Unlimited really refined and polished everything presented there into an overall stronger package. By that point, they had the experience with all the previous DC Animated Universe shows to really give the strongest product they possibly could with these 2 shows. Not only was this the best animation up to this point, which still looks good to this day, But this is the first time that the DCAU had really done large overarching stories as opposed to just having recurring elements throughout the shows. First off, they had the slow build-up to Star-Crossed with all the various elements that you can notice if you go back and watch Season 2 again. Then they had the Cadmus arc in Justice League Unlimited, which I still feel to this day is my favorite arc from any comic book animated series. And even the Legion of Doom arc was a lot of fun to end the series off on. Plus, the series had a lot of respect for what came before it, with tons of references to previous DCAU shows, and even taking elements from them in order to build on them for new arcs. This series, more than any other, is what got me into DC and reading comic books in general. And to me, nothing else has even come close to surpassing it since. And those are what I feel are the best comic book animated series of all time. And I know this was a long one, guys, so I want to thank everyone for sticking with me throughout this, and leave your thoughts and comments about what you think of my list. What are your guys' favorite comic book animated series? And like I said at the beginning, this is something a bit different from me for you guys, so let me know what you thought of it in the comments. Would you like to see more, likely shorter lists from me in the future? Would you like to see more with me with animation? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, this has been Tim from the Hybrid Network, signing out.